I want to welcome my colleagues for the next panel to unmute yourself and show your screen. Wonderful.
You unmute yourself. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this event sponsored by the Ohio State University. My name is Kara Gotsch, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Sentencing Project, and it is my privilege to be moderating this next panel on the class-wide scheduling in fentanyl analogues. So, as was so clearly articulated, we are in the midst of an overdose crisis because of opioids and because of the role that fentanyl analogues have played and have infiltrated drug markets. What we know, though, from decades of the war on drugs and research and lots of experiences on the ground is that the traditional response of the war on drugs, a punitive over-criminalization response, has caused often more harm than good. And so what we hope to do in this next panel is to dig a little deeper, to hear about the impact of and consequences of the current scheduling process, and how it's impacting communities, how it's impacting incarceration levels. And we hope to have time at the end for questions, and I will be monitoring that. So please, if you do have some questions as we go along, I hope to get to a couple of them at the very end. So I'm going to start with our first panelist, Shantae Owens, who's a community leader with Vocal New York's user union, and he's an outreach worker providing harm reduction health services across New York City. Welcome, Shantae. So I want to start with a question for you, Shantae. Your personal experience with drugs, including losing loved ones to overdose, really provides an important lens on the impact and consequences of the war on drugs. How does the expanded criminalization of fentanyl analogues impact your community's safety and health? You're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
You hear me?
I can hear you now. Wonderful.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it impacts my community in a number of ways. I've witnessed a lot of overdose deaths during conducting street-based outreach, giving syringe access and other safe supplies. My biggest concern is the fear of people no longer reaching out to seek harm reduction services if this was to come to pass. And why that is, because I'd like to go back into reminding folks about how hard it was for us during the Good Samaritan law, giving out the naloxone and putting it in the hands of people who are first responders. We had a hard time fighting to get people to understand that it was very important to call 911 in response and an overdose to stop it to becoming a fatal overdose. We have finally got folks to being comfortable with calling 911 in response to an overdose. And my only fear, again, is that should this come to pass, that we will disband all that hard work. People will go back into not seeking harm reduction services. Overdose is going to continue to rise as it has continued to been doing. And people are not going to want to seek to call 911 in response to an overdose. And those overdoses can be fatal. We will lose a lot more people.
So thank you for that, Mr. Owens. You know, in your experience with fentanyl analogues and what you're seeing on the street, do people who use or sell always know fentanyl analogues or fentanyl always even know it's present in the substances that they're taking or the substances that they're selling? What have you seen?
Well, no, a lot of the people that I come in contact with during my outreach, they don't even know. You brought up a very good point. They don't even know what's in it. It's not like they're in the lab. These folks have gotten, and most of them, a lot of them, for some time, it's more like a trade. They're distributing that to support their own substance. So they don't know what that is has fentanyl. They don't even understand what that is. And that brings about the fear again. Folks are dying.
Mhm.
Folks are dying at an increased rate. You know, the community is already being destroyed with the overdose deaths that we already have on hand, and more will become. My fear is more will come if we do not do something to combat this overdose crisis that we're already in.
Do you think people are aware of the penalties associated with fentanyl? You said that a lot of people don't know that they're there. Sometimes in the drugs, either they're using or they're selling. Do you think the average person even knows what the criminal penalties might be associated, that they're higher if fentanyl is present or fentanyl analogs are present?
No, I really don't believe that they understand or even know what that is. And it's hard to try to explain it to folks because you know, an individual, whether we choose to believe it or not, is really seeking help. And the criminal justice system, you know, they don't really want to go through that avenue, you know.
Mhm.
And that puts on a greater strain on their life, which will hinder them from reaching out help because they think that it'll probably be a minor possession charge, and then they can find themselves in a federal institution. You get what I'm saying? That'll make folks totally disband with even a lot of times I hear the hell with it, man. I'm not even going to harm reduction now. They don't need that added stress in their life.
Absolutely. I think some people might respond that, well, you can also get treatment in the criminal justice system. Do you think that's a good alternative for people who might be seeking treatment?
I don't think that will actually work. Myself coming from being incarcerated, it's forced help. A lot of times it's harsh. It's very harsh, and we got to remember that folks already come to us already feeling low. Self-esteem levels are very low. A lot of folks deal with depression. Institution only deal with the substance aspect of it, not the overall of the person, the trauma that they're experiencing in their life. So no, I don't believe that will help.
Thanks, Mr. Owens. So I want to move on now to Jeffrey Lazarus, who is a public defender in the Northern District of Ohio, and which is one of the areas of the country really hard hit by the opioid crisis. He's the assistant federal public defender. Prior to his work with the federal public defender, he was also with the Cuyahoga County Public Defender's Office in Cleveland. So, Jeff, I want you to talk about federal prosecutions that you're seeing in your area, Northeast Ohio, and because they're increasing for fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. Why is that? And what has been your experience, the experience of your clients facing prosecution in these cases?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Here in the Northern District of Ohio, we are either the #1 or #2 district in the whole country in fentanyl analog prosecutions. And we really started to see an uptick in the numbers beginning in the summer of 2018, when I think it was then Attorney General Jeff Sessions enacted Operation SOS. So this was a federal law enforcement program targeting certain cities to focus for federal prosecutions for fentanyl analog cases. One of the 10 cities was Lorain, which is the suburb or the county just west of the Cleveland area. Lorain had seen a huge number of opioid addicted people and a large number of opioid related deaths, and it was identified as one of these target cities. So this led to our U.S. Attorney's Office deciding to enact a number of state prosecutions into federal prosecutions. So people who were charged with heroin or opioid or fentanyl analog crimes in the state court were then diverted into federal court, where our U.S. attorney decided to charge them. The result was a huge jump in the number of federal prosecutions here in the Northern District of Ohio. We've seen that be pretty constant over the last 2.5 years. The result of that is that our clients are facing statutory mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines ranges that just completely dwarf anything they were facing in the state. It's our belief that these prosecutions cast an extremely wide net and isn't consistent with the goals of Operation SOS. We've really seen two problematic areas of these prosecutions. The first one is that our U.S. attorneys are prosecuting very low-level drug traffickers. These are street traffickers, not kingpins, not even mid-level people, but just people on the street selling to confidential informants or getting stopped for a traffic stop that happened to have a small amount of fentanyl analog. I've had cases where we see someone who is being charged with just 2 grams of fentanyl analog. And we're not saying that these cases shouldn't be prosecuted, but they should remain in the state, which is where we believe the penalties are more consistent with the crime. And the truth of the matter is that many of the defendants that I have are people who are drug addicted to opioids themselves and are only selling these drugs in small amounts to feed their own habits. Had they continued to be prosecuted in the state, they would have an opportunity to seek drug treatment as an alternative to prison. But when they're prosecuted federally, there's no ability for treatment. Almost all of my clients in these cases are going to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. But more importantly, their sentencing exposure is far greater than they would have seen on the state level. In addition to the mandatory minimums that they face, their sentencing guidelines are 2, 3, 4, even 5 times as great as they would get in the state. The other area that we're seeing is defendants who are charged with fentanyl analogs only because a small proportion of the drug that they were selling was actually fentanyl analog. So I'm seeing a lot of cases, and I've had a number of clients where they were a cocaine dealer or they thought they were selling heroin, but someone at some stage in the process, some level much higher than where they were, was cutting these drugs. And because of the widespread availability of fentanyl analogs and because of its cheap price, was using fentanyl analog to cut the drugs. So even though my client thought he was selling an ounce and a half of cocaine, it happened to contain 0.1% of fentanyl analog. So then the whole bag is treated as fentanyl analog. And now my client is facing a 5-year minimum and is facing sentencing guidelines that far exceed that, whereas they would be facing a much more manageable sentence under state crimes. I also wanted to talk about the disparate impact that we've seen in these prosecutions because of race. Keep in mind that the state and federal law enforcement is picking and choosing which defendants are facing state charges and which ones should be sent to federal court for increased prosecutions. For example, Lorain County, this target city, has an 85% demographic of people who are Caucasian, and only 9% of people in the county are African American. But to contrast that, every single client that I've had out of Lorain County who was charged with the fentanyl analog is African American. So we believe that because the U.S. attorneys are picking and choosing which defendants go to federal court, that the fallout is that it happens to have a severe racial disparate impact.
Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit, Jeff, about what happens at arrest? And so we know that mandatory minimums subject people to long periods of incarceration once they're convicted. But what's happening to folks prior to their conviction, just when they're arrested? What's the experience of your clients there?
So in federal court, not everybody gets a bond. If the prosecutor decides that they want our client to be held without bond, either because they're a risk of flight or an alleged danger to the community, then they can be held without bond for the entire duration of their case. In federal drug cases, I think it's 94% of all federal drug cases carry a presumption of detention, which means that the judge will presume that our client should be held without bond simply because it's a drug case. So as a result, here in the Northern District of Ohio, about 60% of our clients are in pretrial detention and have to stay in detention for the entire duration of their case. And it's much higher in federal drug cases, and it's even higher than that for cases involving analogs. So this is very different from state prosecutions, that in a state prosecution, a defendant could post bail and could go into drug treatment in order to treat their habit, or could go back to work, or could go back to their family. But the pretrial detention rates here in federal court are so high that it's resulting in a lot of our clients being locked up and feeling a sense of hopelessness as their case draws near.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to move around a little bit, and we'll come back to you, Jeff, and we'll come back to Shantae, but I want to get to our next panelist to sort of reflect on everything all you both have been saying about the impact on communities, on your clients, on your neighbors and friends of these sentencing federal approaches to drugs and law enforcement. And so I want to bring in Premal Dharia, who is the inaugural executive director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at Harvard Law School. Welcome, thank you for joining us. This will launch, that program launches this summer. But most recently, she worked toward systematic change by founding and directing the Defender Impact Initiative. So I want to give us sort of a big picture, Premal. So you've heard what Shantae and Jeff has said. You know, how did we get here? Why is this sort of our reality? Why are the feds leading the charge in prosecuting low-level drug cases? And why is fentanyl analog sort of like captured, you know, the drug du jour right now that lawmakers or the Drug Enforcement Administration seem so fixated on?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you to the other panelists for such helpful and insightful comments. You know, I mean, there are a few big picture reasons we're here. You know, one is political rhetoric, right? Which is not grounded in evidence and is very much grounded in misinformation, as some of the prior speakers have highlighted. We're also here because of entrenched racism, right? These are the realities, and we need to, you know, start being much more honest than we have been, I think, about a lot of this misinformation and the racism. You know, if we think about the war on drugs and the history of the war on drugs, going back to its origins, you know, a lot of it was very much intended to criminalize people, not conduct, right? So, you know, it started with sort of efforts to criminalize Chinese immigrants, and then moving to criminalizing Black men, and then moving to criminalizing, you know, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. And now, you know, with respect to fentanyl analogs and prosecutions, that entrenched racism has not changed at all, and that theme continues. You know, in 2018, 77% of people prosecuted for fentanyl analogs were people of color. In 2019, 68% were people of color. These numbers are stark and they're real. And so we need to be talking about that thread and theme as a real reason that we're here. There's also a lot of political rhetoric, despite the fact that, you know, tens of millions of Americans continue to struggle with addiction and substance use, and that drug supply and demand have not decreased, and that community destruction and incarceration rates have increased. We continue down this path of politicians amplifying rhetoric about the utility of the criminal punishment system as a way to address what's a public health crisis and public health needs. And I think Shantae spoke really helpfully about some, you know, the public health cost here and the real community cost. And so, you know, we have 3 decades of evidence to show that this kind of approach hasn't worked. And we have no evidence to support that it does work. And, you know, with respect to that, I just want to also follow up a little bit on what Jeff was saying about mandatory minimums. You know, there's been no, despite sort of people having looked at mandatory minimums and wondered whether they work or not, the evidence shows that there's no measurable impact on deterrence, right? And yet here we are with politicians seeking to expand the use of mandatory minimums, despite the evidence showing that they don't do what they're supposedly intended to do. Mandatory minimums also, which are, you know, potentially being expanded here, and which we need to really guard against. Also, in addition to what Jeff was mentioning about bond and pretrial detention, create all kinds of coercions and pressures on people who are facing prosecution, right? People who are arrested, if facing mandatory minimum charges, often feel coerced into pleading guilty to avoid certain kinds of time. They often police misconduct and police, you know, conduct generally goes unexamined and unrevealed because there's no motions litigation that happens. There's no motion to suppress hearing that happens. All of these things that our criminal, you know, due process sort of contemplates often don't happen because of the existence of mandatory minimums. So I just want to highlight that as well. There's so many different ways in which the evidence doesn't support this kind of expansion, and doesn't support any expansion of the war on drugs, and in fact supports the opposite. And yet we find ourselves here again.
You know, it's interesting because the current president, Joe Biden, you know, run on a campaign of ending mandatory minimums, but here in his, you know, first few months is confronted with the Drug Enforcement Administration, you know, presumably, or we don't know exactly what their position is going to be, you know, but if continuing the class-wide scheduling beyond May 6th means essentially that it will be expanding more substances, making them eligible for mandatory minimums. How do we reconcile the sort of this duality of, you know, not just the current president, but this, in recent years, this bipartisanship around at the federal level around drug mandatory minimums and the need to reduce them, yet we're still having sort of a similar conversation over and over again about having to re-articulate why mandatory minimums are so harsh and for drugs and that they should need to be revisited. And here is an example of it going the other way. How do we understand that in this current bipartisan sort of narrative that we also are a part of?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. You know, there is, I think, a growing consensus in our country, at least among community members, if not among politicians, that we can't incarcerate our way out of this crisis, or any of these crises, but certainly not the public health crisis that faces us here. And yet politicians turn to incarceration. You know, it feeds into this sort of alarmist popular imagination that the media has helped to build, that politicians have helped to build, about how to address problems that we have. And, you know, I think that you know, there are so many organizations right now and so many advocates who are doing a wonderful job of telling the truth, right? Of telling the honest truth about what this really is, and that this is not evidence-based, it doesn't work. And in fact, it's causing great harm. And there are alternative, concrete alternative solutions that are grounded in public health. You know, Drug Policy Alliance has put out a number of, you know, very thoughtful, concrete policy options for addressing these harms. And so, you know, I think it's a question of more and more people listening and talking about the truth of a lack of evidence, and the truth of the racism, and the truth of the fact that this is a public health crisis, and a change in media and narrative around some of these things too. We need to start calling out politicians when they're providing misinformation, as in, you know, the Barr op-ed that was discussed earlier. It's clear misinformation, and I think that the more that we can provide public education and opportunities for people to grasp at the truth, which is very clear, the more we can do that.
Great, thanks so much. So there are a number of questions in the Q&A, and I wanted to try and get to some. I see some. I'm going to try to navigate, ask questions and read the questions at the same time. So, and I'll throw these out for any of the panelists to answer. But I'll start with the first one from Eric Sterling, which is, says, isn't it inevitable that creating city level targets for prosecution is going to lead to street level prosecutions? If the international supply is the target, the investigation should be based outside the US, yes? Does anyone want to talk to that? You know, the feds, as Jeff has pointed out in the opening discussions have pointed out, they're disproportionately going after street level prosecutions, and you know, that's local law enforcement could certainly handle.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, the reason that the federal law enforcement is getting involved, and they think that the street level prosecutions will lead to moving up the chain, that they'll be able to get the mid-level people, and the mid-level people will provide cooperation to the higher level people, and that it'll eventually move up the chain. But it's not working. Clearly it's not. I mean, it works in some cases, but very few in the grand scheme of things. But what they're doing is they're really casting, in my opinion, too wide of a net. They're getting people at the lowest level and really throwing them in prison for 5, 10, 15 years with a goal that is not achievable. I mean, I think the idea of trying to do prosecutions outside the country, I mean, is really an issue that law enforcement should probably endeavor, but starting at the local level just seems very counterintuitive.
Thanks. I have another question from David Jimenez. Is the problem in these circumstances, and we talked about this with Shantae, and Jeff also mentioned this, how folks don't know in fentanyl analogs or in the substances they're selling. So his question is the problem that mens rea requirements in federal sentencing are far too inadequate to begin with, or does emergency scheduling distinctly weaken those protections?
I think I would agree that the mens rea requirement is a problem. Under, at least in our circuit, you don't have to prove, if you're prosecuted for having a fentanyl analog, the government doesn't have to prove that you knowingly intended to distribute a fentanyl analog. They just have to prove that you knowingly intended to distribute a controlled substance. So, and I've had this in other cases where we've litigated the idea that my client had and intended to traffic powder cocaine, which has, is a much smaller sentencing exposure than a fentanyl analog that happened to be a part of the substance that he sold. But that's inadequate. They just have to prove that there was an illegal drug involved, and then he's accountable for the most serious of the controlled substance that's in there. So that there, I mean, we've litigated this, but the law is not on our side right now.
Thanks. Anyone else want to respond to that? Okay. Here's another comment from Eric Sterling. The contains a detectable amount is absurd, carrying over description of the circumstances that reflects drug enforcement strategies from a century ago that were explicitly targeted on persons who used and who often were sentenced to the Federal Addiction Hospital in Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky. An important reform is removed. From his perspective, an important reform is to remove the any detectable amount language from the Controlled Substances Act. Any thoughts on that? The trigger quantities around for fentanyl analog mandatory minimums having this, as Eric characterized it, absurd. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, hello, this is Shantae. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the point was brought up greatly that I think we're somehow missing the point. Is that the point of it is for the probably the start of it probably was to catch the big fishes, that have been the focal point for decades, but that just haven't been the outcome. The outcome has always been catching low-level offenders who are actually trying to support their own habit themselves, and now they find themselves in a more horrendous circumstances where they're now facing 10 to 15 years in prison. I think the point of it is that the science have shown that has not worked. That continues to show it has not worked. We need to do better. We can do better.
Thank you, Shantae. Shantae, do you want to tell us, the audience, a little bit about the work that you're doing as an alternative approach to the current situation around opioids and fentanyl analogs in particular? As an example, as what we can do better in our response to drugs.
Well, what I would, suggest that we can do harm reduction has shown to work. Syringe access, linking people back into care, whether it's Hep C navigation testing. But there's other things that we can do, like I was saying, when I feel like we can do better. Even though pharmacies are allowed to sell a participant syringes, there's a limit on the amount that they can sell. I believe that we should do away with that limit. A person should be able to purchase as many syringes as they would need. That helps just preventing the spread of HIV, Hep C, which is shown for a person to get through sharing needles, because our agency and most harm reduction centers syringe exchange programs closes during the weekend, excuse me. And so folks are kind of forced to get whatever supplies they need by Friday. That doesn't count for Saturday and Sunday. So then the question is, what do I do? Do I wait till Monday? Of course, a person's not, 9 times out of 10 is not going to wait till Monday when the agency opens back up. I would say that it will be more helpful, like with vocal outreach team. We supply individuals with 10-pack bag, which has got sterile syringes, cookers, injection supplies, and it also includes a voucher where they can go to a pharmacy and purchase additional syringes, should they need that access. We also should start, I believe it was briefly talked about, we need to start having a conversation. We need to start being honest and having a conversation. Look, we all know that this is here. It is affecting almost every neighborhood, not just here in New York City, in Ohio, and Philadelphia. It's almost everywhere. But we need to stop with the hush hush. Not in my community, not in my backyard. We need to start being more honest with ourselves and saying, look, our people are dying. Our family members are dying. We are losing our community. And we need to come together as a community, because I believe that it takes a community to raise a child, and do better. Say, what can I do? How can we help overcoming this overdose? Again, forced incarceration has not worked. I come from a product of being incarcerated. I can honestly say that I am the person that I am today through harm reduction, getting case management, which helped me get into back to employment, job researching, getting my GED, starting with the GED, moving up to that into education, to becoming a person of an employable today. That has worked for me. And I go out on the street, and other folks have told, I've run into countless of participants that said, hey, I got my life together through harm reduction. Again, I think we need to be more open with ourselves and start the conversation. We need to have the conversation.
Well, certainly having you talk about your experience, Shantae, and being on this panel is really an important first step in having that conversation. I think traditionally, the policy response has been, there's been a single policy response from lawmakers, which is punitive, right? Locking people up. We don't like a behavior, we're just going to lock it away and not confront it. And the issue is we are in the midst of a crisis now, an overdose crisis where thousands of people are dying, and it's only getting worse. And so we've got to change, because we have had this punitive approach for decades now, and it hasn't worked. And we are in the midst of this crisis, and we've got to try something new. And I think what you talking about, Shantae, is just so exciting about, and you serve as a model of how this alternative approach of harm reduction can work. So thank you. I want to go on to another question. This one is for Premal. This comes from Lex Coleman. To me, the class-wide overbreadth of fentanyl analogues, like the entire drug quantity table, simply shows how ineffective tying criminal culpability to drug type and quantity really is. at the end of the day, aren't most of the prosecuted citizens street level dealings?
Yeah, I mean, I think, absolutely. I think that there's been, there are lots of misfires here, right? In terms of stated intentions and what the war on drugs and criminal prosecutions around drugs have led to and have resulted in. Only 14% of people incarcerated federally are so-called leaders or managers in any of these kinds of offenses, right? So, I mean, that's I think a pretty stark number that tells you who's being prosecuted and for what. And I think Jeff's earlier point about a lot of state prosecutions being taken up by federal authorities is another sort of, point along these lines, which is that they're often political motivations, right, that have nothing to do with really thinking about public safety or health in choosing how we prosecute these things or how we classify them. I think another piece of this that sort of highlights a lot of the absurdity of implementation is the use of mandatory minimums attached to quantity, right? The mandatory minimums, which, frankly, the government has essentially conceded don't work in enacting the First Step Act, and which evidence has shown for years don't effectively deter crime, are now being further tied to quantity in a way that's destructive and harmful. So yeah, I think those are really good points.
Thank you. Shantae, I have a follow-up question for you. This is from Andrew Kessler. He asked if you can be more specific around what harm reductions are most effective. What programs what are you specifically talking about when you're talking about harm reduction programs that have made a difference in people's lives?
Yeah, so like with Vocal, and the user union, which I am a great part of being a community leader. It doesn't discriminate. It's made up actually of active and former users who is given a chance to sit at a round table and make policy decisions, to go to your local politicians and let them know what's going on in the community. Syringe access. As everyone should know, at one time, HIV was skyrocketing. We were losing countless of people. Most of that was through sharing unsafe syringes. With the legalized syringe exchange program, it allowed folks to come into and register for a syringe exchange program, receive clean sterile syringes and injection supplies, and it brought that trend. It crippled it. There's case managements. There's case managers at harm reduction where you can sit. Again, it's about dealing with the person, the trauma the person have gone through, sitting with a case manager and working through that stuff, that bottom gut wrenching stuff that we don't talk about, and bring that out. Then asking if a person is willing to be involved in a back to workforce program.
I am in the middle of
Sorry. Hello?
I apologize. I was just trying to get my young son out of the room.
Sorry, so I thought it was my camera. Sorry. Yeah, those are processes that has helped shape my life and countless of others. And if we start looking into new ways that again may become scary to some, like a safe injection facility, removing the 10 limited syringe access from pharmacies, expanding the naloxone training. These are things that, from my perspective, I believe that we can really truly combat this overdose crisis that we are in. I see nothing. I wonder if that's.
Hey, there's Kara. Okay.
Thank you. I'm back. Thank you so much, Shantae. I have one more. I think we have time for maybe one more question or two. So here we have one for either Jeff or Premal. Are there, from Dave Borden, are there any health consequences for users that have been observed to result from fentanyl prosecutions? For example, in pretrial detention, what kind of drug treatment services might be available for people going through withdrawal? It might be an example. But if you have personal experience with clients or know of others that know other examples, that would be something you could
Well,
talk.
I mean, I'll say that most of my clients who are going through withdrawal have to do it in pretrial detention. That it's very unfortunate and it's awful, and to have to deal with that person while they're going through that is very tough to watch. But I've had a few success stories that have really opened my eyes to how beneficial treatment can be. I had a client last year who had a severe opioid addiction. And he got in debt to his drug dealer, and in order to pay off his debt was selling in drugs in small quantities and making deliveries on his dealer's behalf. And he got caught up in it, and him and his dealer got charged. I was able to get him on pretrial release, which is a very rare circumstance for a case involving opioid crimes. Got him immediately into drug treatment, and he was in drug treatment for a while, and then he did outpatient treatment, and it got to a point where he did so well that we were able to get him probation, and he's been clean for about 9 months now. And but that's just such a small percentage of the clients we see, even though so many of them should be having that opportunity to get into treatment, to clean themselves up, to show their sentencing judge that they can be trusted in the community and not go to prison. When I was a county public defender, I spent time in the drug court. Cuyahoga County has a really good drug court program, which is an alternative to prison, and it's an alternative to a prosecution. They end up getting their case dismissed if they complete successfully. We don't have that in federal court here in the Northern District of Ohio. There's no real alternative dockets or alternatives to prison, and it's a binary choice of whether they're going to spend a lengthy time in prison or whether they're in that few category of people who can end up getting treatment. But it's not widespread enough that I feel that we're making a difference.
Can I just add a couple of things? I want to, emphasize and highlight the importance of a public health response to all of these things, right? Treatment, of course, safe spaces, and, all of the sort of things that Shantae and others have talked about is, I think, the Drug Policy Alliance is very clearly outlined policy responses for ways to address these things. I want to disrupt the idea that the criminal system, is or could be a source of any kind of public health response. It's a punishment system. And while I think we can and should be focused on treatment and public health, I think we need to really think hard about how that can be disconnected from the sort of carceral impulses of arrest, prosecution, and jailing as ways to proceed. In my experience, in terms of clients who are arrested and detained pretrial or serving sentences, but particularly in the pretrial context, the treatment options are minimal, and medical and healthcare options, frankly, are either non-existent or minimal. I think the COVID pandemic crisis has really highlighted this, right, for much more of the country than maybe previously realized it. But for often people in withdrawal are given aspirin and put in solitary, right? These are the kinds of responses that we get from carceral facilities, and so I just I want to disrupt the idea that we can or should be trying harder to provide more healthcare through that system, as opposed to removing the idea of treatment from that and pursuing it elsewhere.
Thanks so much. So we have about a minute left. I want to thank all of you for joining and participating in this discussion. It was really excellent. I do want to give you a moment each if you have any final thoughts, closing remarks that you want to leave our audience with. Shantae? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I would just like to reiterate that we need to start having the conversation. There's a lot of thoughts out there that people say, oh, these people don't, you might hear it all the time, these people don't want help. I can speak against that. I know these individuals do want help. prom kid, I had an opportunity to go upstate with a mother who lost a child who was in incarceration and got punished for smuggling medication to help save his life. That medication was taken from him, in which he died. So there's so many different other levels of examples. But again, we need to start having the conversation. We need to have this honest, open conversation, no matter how scary it may be.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss our cases and these issues facing my clients and our district.
Thank you.
Same. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of our conference. Take care.